End quote. You Don and Oppos, T own this road anymore. End quote. That's what she said, standing there with this terrifyingly perfect posture, clutching a clipboard like it was a holy relic, and looking at me as if I were a smudge of dirt on her expensive loafers. But the thing is, she wasn't Oppos. T just some stranger. She was the president of a homeowners association that didn't in Oppos. T even exist when my grandfather hammered the first stake into this dirt back in 1972. I remember sitting in my truck, the engine still ticking as it cooled down, staring at this massive industrial-grade steel gate that was suddenly bifurcating my world, a cold slab of metal topped with fresh razor wire that smelled like ozone and wet paint. And for a second, I actually thought I was at the wrong house, but no. I could see my porch, I could see the swing where I drink my coffee every morning, just a few hundred yards away. Yet it might as well have been on the moon because this woman, this Margot Vance, had decided that my family's 50-year legacy was now subject to her, end quote, community standards, end quote. I didn't in Oppos. TL, I didn't in Oppos. To even get out of the truck at first, I just sat there feeling my pulse thumping in my fingertips, and I pulled out my phone to record because in my line of work, I'm a field surveyor and a bit of a history nut. You learn pretty quickly that when people try to rewrite the present, you have to lean hard on the past. Margot walked up to my window, giving me that practiced, predatory smile that high-end real estate lawyers use right before they evict a widow, and she tapped on the glass with a manicured fingernail, telling me that the end quote, Oak Creek Estates, end quote, had officially incorporated my parcel into their jurisdiction, and since I had an Oppos, T paid the $15,000 in, end quote, back dues, end quote. For the infrastructure upgrades I never asked for, my access to the main highway was now, end quote, temporarily suspended, end quote, for the safety of the community. It was the most polite way of telling someone they were a prisoner on their own land that I'd ever heard. And as I looked past her at the neat rows of identical beige houses that had sprouted up like a fungus on the neighboring lot over the last 3 years, I realized this was an end Oppos. T, just a misunderstanding. It was a siege. I've lived in this valley my entire life. I know every dip in the road and every creek bed, and I knew for a fact that my deed included an ironclad, perpetual easement through that specific stretch of land to get to Route 41. But Margot didn't in Oppos. T cared about facts, she cared about leverage, and she knew that by blocking my only exit, she was forcing my hand. I spent that first night sitting in the dark, watching the red blink of my security cameras and listening to the wind whistle through that new razor wire, feeling this primal sense of violation that's hard to put into words. It's like someone reaching into your pocket and telling you your own keys Don and Oppos. T work anymore. The next morning, I hiked 3 miles through the dense timber on the backside of my property, crossing through brambles and old logging trails at Haven and Oppos. T been touched since the 80s, just to get to the county clerk's office, and when I finally stood there, covered in burrs and sweat, the lady behind the counter looked at me like I was a ghost. End quote, Mr. Sterling, end quote, she said, pulling up my digital file while I stood there trying to catch my breath, end quote. Your deed is crystal clear. That easement was recorded decades before Oak Creek even bought the old Miller farm for their subdivision, end quote. But then her face went pale, and she turned the monitor toward me, showing me a recently filed, end quote, annexation amendment, end quote, that looked like it had been signed by me, a jagged, messy scrawl that was supposed to be my signature consenting to join the HOA and waiving my private road rights in exchange for, end quote, community maintenance, end quote. My heart didn't in Oppos. T just dropped. It turned into a lead weight in my chest because I realized right then that Margot wasn't in Oppos. T just a pushy neighbor. She was a criminal who had forged my identity to fix a, end quote, hole, end quote, in her map. She needed my road to complete her loop, and she was willing to commit a felony to get it. I didn't in Oppos. T go to the, end quote, emergency board meeting, end quote, to beg for my keys back. Instead, I called an old friend, a guy named Silas who spent 30 years litigating land disputes and eats people like Margot for breakfast. And when I told him what was happening, he didn't in Oppos. To even laugh, he just got real quiet and asked me if I still had the original physical deed from the 70s. When I told him it was in my floor safe, he told me to stay put, to keep the cameras rolling, and to let them think they were winning because the higher they built their wall, the harder it would fall on them when the time came. For the next 3 days, I lived like a survivalist, recording every time they're, end quote, security patrol, end quote, SUV sat at the gate with its engine idling. Every time Margot walked by with her clipboard to admire her handiwork, and even the moment they started pouring concrete for a permanent guard shack, right in the middle of my legal right-of-way. The tension was vibrating in the air like a live wire. And on Thursday morning, the mailman, who had to hand-deliver my packages through the fence like he was visiting a prison, gave me a thick envelope with a, notice of injunction, from the county court, claiming I was being sued for 10 different types of harassment and, unauthorized use of private HOA infrastructure, I looked at the seal, I looked at the judge's name, and then I called Silas, who did a quick search and started laughing this deep, gravelly laugh that made me feel 1,000 times better. Beckett, he said, there is no Judge Miller in this district, and that case number is for a traffic ticket in the next county over. She didn't in oppose. T just forged a signature. She forged a court order, That was the turning point, the moment the fear evaporated and was replaced by this cold, surgical clarity, because Margot Vance had made the one mistake a bully always makes. She assumed I was too small to fight back, and too poor to know the law. I waited until Friday afternoon, the day they were planning to hold a, grand opening, for their new gated entrance, with balloons and a ribbon-cutting ceremony for all the new residents who thought they were buying into an exclusive paradise. I didn't oppose. Hike out through the woods this time. I sat in my old flatbed truck, the one with the reinforced steel bumper, and I watched through my binoculars as Margot stood there in a white dress, holding a pair of giant golden scissors, telling the crowd about how they had, secured the perimeter, increased property values, by unifying the land. Just as she was about to snip that ribbon, 3 black SUVs from the sheriff's department and a white sedan from the district attorney's office pulled up, and Silas stepped out of his car with a stack of papers that looked like a death warrant for her career. I didn't oppose to even have to drive through the gate. The sheriff's deputies walked up to the guard, handed him a real court order, the kind with a real judge's signature, and told him to unlock the gate or they'd cut it off the hinges with a torch. I watched Margot's face go from triumphant to ashen, then to a sickly shade of green as Silas handed her the annexation amendment, and asked her, in front of all her neighbors, why her notary's stamp had been expired for 2 years and why my signature looked like it had been traced by a kindergartner. The silence that fell over that crowd was the loudest thing I've ever heard, a heavy, suffocating quiet as 50 families realized their, secure, neighborhood was built on a foundation of fraud, and that their HOA fees were likely being funneled into a legal defense fund they didn't oppose. Know they needed. They arrested her right there on the sidewalk she thought she owned for forgery and illegal restraint, and as they led her away in handcuffs, she actually had the audacity to look at me and hiss that I was, destroying the community, I didn't oppose. Say anything, I just climbed back into my truck, waited for the deputies to swing those steel gates wide open, and drove out onto the highway for the first time in a week, feeling the wind on my face and knowing that the dirt under my tires was finally, truly mine again. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night, and the reason I'm telling you this. After the dust settled and Margot was disbarred, the HOA didn't oppose. Just disappear. It just went into, receivership, and now half of my neighbors want oppose. Even look me in the eye because their property values plummeted 30% the day the scandal hit the news. They don oppose. See a guy who fought for his rights. They see the man who broke their dream of an exclusive, perfect world, and it makes me wonder, if you had to choose between being a, prisoner, in a beautiful, fake paradise or being free in a world that hates you for it, which one would you pick? Because I look at that empty spot where the gate used to be every single morning, and even though I won, it feels like I'm still living on an island, just without the fences. What do you think? Did I go too far by blowing up the whole HOA's reputation, or was Margot just the tip of the iceberg in a system that's designed to strip us of our autonomy, community rule, at a time? I've seen people lose their homes over the height of their grass, but this felt like a war for the soul of the land itself. Drop a comment and let me know if you've ever dealt with a, Margot, in your life, or if you think I should have just paid the dues to keep the peace, because I'm starting to think that in the eyes of some people, the truth is a lot less valuable than a neat lawn.